Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. When I was in seminary, I had a theology professor who would use a phrase that has stuck with me ever since. What we say and how we say it matters. Applied to matters of theology and faith, the idea is that it's not only important that we accurately convey a theological idea, but that the way we convey that idea, the words and tone we use, are just as important to our communication. This has been especially front of mind as I look at a landscape rife with an angry tone and widespread othering language. Thinking back to last week's episode, it almost seems fair to say that different sides are not only talking past each other, but using the same words with completely different definitions in mind. With this in mind, I wanted to have a conversation with someone who has not only spent a great deal of time thinking about language, but could help Christians explore the way we use language as part of our public witness. I couldn't think of anyone better to explore this idea with than Dr. Greg Coles. Gregory Coles is a writer and speaker who lives in Boise, Idaho. Greg holds a PhD in English from Penn State, and his novel, The Limits of My World, explores the ways language makes us who we are and defines how we see others. Greg is also the author of Single Gay Christian and No Longer Strangers, and is a senior research fellow at the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. Through our conversation, you'll learn more about how we can use our language to better care for our neighbor, the ways the meanings of our words can change over time, and the grace given to us as we try to describe aspects of an indescribable God. Before we begin, I do want to pause and make a brief note. In the next two episodes, this and the one that follows, we will be talking to two individuals who specialize, and in some cases have professional experience, in topics related to sexuality, gender identity, and the LGBT community. While our conversations will not be specifically about these topics, they will be present in each conversation. I recognize that there are, in some cases, deep differences in opinion and belief across the church body related to sexuality and gender identity. I do not expect that everyone who listens to this podcast will agree with everything our guests believe, a statement that holds not only for the next 2 weeks, but could potentially be said in relation to any one of our guests. Indeed, our next two guests don't hold the same beliefs as one another. But what I think they would agree on, and the posture I hope we all can take, is that we have many things we can learn from people who hold beliefs different from our own. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast will not often focus on topics related to sexuality and gender. There are many other resources with people more knowledgeable and versed in those areas who are intentionally focused on those topics. But when it makes sense to discuss a related topic on the podcast, or to hear from an individual who can help us think more deeply about biblical justice, we will be open to having those conversations. You won't be asked to suspend your beliefs when you come to those conversations, but I do hope you will take a posture of humility, the posture of a learner, and will treat others as fellow image bearers of God. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Dr. Greg Coles. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Greg, thank you for joining me here today.
Oh, thanks for having me. A pleasure to be with you, Eric.
This will be interesting, at least on my end, because we're going to be talking about things that I know you know, but that I haven't heard you talk about before. So we'll see how things go on that
excellent.
end, I guess.
Let's hope they come out of my mouth roughly as anticipated.
I guess I have zero anticipation, I guess. That's not true. I have not that sort of anticipation. So we'll jump in here, I guess. I'm not great at banter. People will find that out if they don't already know. So we're getting there. We're learning. But maybe we can start off with how you ended up in a PhD program about English. What was your path and how did you decide to pursue that?
Yeah, so when I finished undergrad, well, when I was in undergrad, I was studying communication, and the program that I was in had a really strong emphasis on rhetorical theory, like the philosophy of language, understanding how language shapes the world and the world shapes language. And a number of the professors I worked with were like, "Oh, you should go to grad school," and I was like, "No, no, no, no grad school for me. I'm gonna serve Jesus." Which I'm still enthusiastic about serving Jesus, to be clear. But I had a very particular vision of what that ought to look like. So when I finished undergrad, I went and started working for a church, and within a couple months of working there, I realized, like, number one, this is lovely and delightful, and in many ways I could do this forever. But also there were other ways in which I began to sense, oh, I'm not actually sure that working for a church, at least this church in this season of my life, maybe this is not actually the most effective way in which I can serve Jesus. So then I started to cast about and think through, like, what could I perhaps be doing instead? One of the things that I loved, as I was working at this church, was working with the college students, being around a college campus and having opportunities to engage with thoughtful, interesting people about deep ideas in a way that brought God into the conversation. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe I should go to grad school, get a PhD, and then I could be a professor. And so I looked into graduate programs, and I was basically like, well, theology is super interesting. Maybe I could study theology, but most of those programs cost a ton of money, and I was not, shall we say, rolling in the dough. I mean, by global and historic standards, I was absurdly wealthy, as the vast majority of us are in the US today. But as far as like people who just want to pay out of pocket for a PhD in theology, I was not one of those people. And so I was thinking, like, well, is there a way I could go to grad school, but maybe like get paid for it instead of paying for it? And so that brought me back around to rhetorical theory. And I was like, I did love this. I did think this was really fascinating. So those were the PhD programs that I got into in a way that I could afford. And I think relatively quickly, I came around to embrace the idea that there is actually something potentially incredibly fruitful about having people who love Jesus and are committed to the work of the kingdom be really thoughtful about the nature of language, about how we engage with it as people of faith, to not be afraid of the kinds of conversations that are unfolding around what language is and how it works within the academy, but to actually enter into those spaces. So that was how I wound up in graduate school and studying language, and ended up being quite happy about it.
Yeah. And what was some of the like what does rhetorical theory look like in an academic setting? Because I told you, we had a conversation a couple days ago. I told you that I'd read the abstract of your dissertation, and I would be lying if I said I understood all of it or maybe even most of it. So what does that look like?
I mean, and of course, isn't this often so true of certain parts of the academy? Like, I'm sure many of the concepts I'm wrestling with within the dissertation would make tons of sense to you, and you would find them perhaps fascinating. You strike me as an intelligent fellow. But there is, in some cases, you wind up really deep in a very specific debate that's been going on for a very long time, and they've developed a certain kind of vocabulary, and everybody knows what certain words mean, and you're referring to debates that are, as old as time. So in the case of what I was doing, I was, in large part, I wound up working with the ideas of a guy named Kenneth Burke, who's writing in the 20th century about how language works. He's writing literary criticism. He's writing really bad poetry. He's just kind of writing a bit of everything. But one of the things he's wrestling with is the way that language can kind of start to function as like a shortcut, a time saver. Like me saying the word chair to you is a lot easier than me trying to like lift up my chair and show it to you and point to it and be like, this thing. So like language becomes sort of a shortcut to doing the work of actually demonstrating in every case exactly what it is we're trying to do. And so Burke is wrestling with this idea of the shortcut, and he says, often shortcuts serve us really well. they give us these capacities, but then sometimes the capacities that we develop start to incapacitate us in other ways. So Burke has this concept he's drawing from Thorstein Veblen, this other theorist guy, who talks about trained incapacity. And what Burke is pointing to is like if you train chickens to hear a bell and know like, oh, it's time for food, and they run for the food. This is like a shortcut in their brains, right? The chickens hear the bell, they go for the food, and it serves them really well. They get lots of food out of it. And then someday the farmer rings the bell so that, they can all be gathered for slaughter. And suddenly in that moment, the shortcut that was supposed to serve them winds up not serving them so very well after all. And so Burke is wrestling with this question of like, we can become trained in ways that feel like they've developed these fruitful shortcuts for us, and they can be genuinely fruitful so much of the time, but then something may come along that causes them to be unfruitful, that causes them to be the opposite of fruitful. And how do we sort of grapple with that moment where the very shortcut, the very language that has served us becomes also a thing that incapacitates us? So that's some of what Burke is wrestling with. That's some of the question of what I wound up wrestling with in my dissertation. But yeah, I mean, among other things, it was just a lot of reading and like thinking about ideas and looking at social movements and trying to be like, how are these people using language? Let's see how it's working. It was a great time. I had fun, arguably too much fun. But yeah, I commend it to anyone who thinks that doing a lot of reading and writing is a really good time.
Yeah. And those are such interesting topics because I think it comes into play not just in the academy. It is like how we are talking and relating to each other. So if I haven't said this already for the listeners, part of why I wanted to talk about this today is because I've had a thing playing in my head for a long time that my Theology 1 professor in seminary said, is that what we say and how we say it matters, especially when it comes to issues of theology, Christian life, and things of that nature. And so I think it's a thing that we need to be conscious of as we're talking about what we talk about. Not just talking about what we talk about, talk how we are talking about what we talk about. So some of this is going to be theoretical, dear listener, but hopefully we will get to the practical of sort of thinking through how this applies to our Christian life. Off the top, do you have any sort of immediate application or immediate thoughts of how what you studied applies to Christian life?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things I would say, and I'm struck, and I'm sure we'll get more into some of the theological side of this and how language relates to what we see modeled in Scripture, even. But I love that passage of Paul where he's talking about how he's made himself all things to all people. To the Jews I became as a Jew, to those not under the law I became like one not under the law, etc. And I think I'm struck in Paul by that willingness to not simply pick a particular track that feels comfortable for him and say, well, great, this is the track that works for me to do the gospel thing, so I'm going to stick with this track. But he's actually willing to look around and say, well, how can I serve this group of people? How can I serve that group of people? How can I adapt what I'm doing? And even as I think we see him model in various ways, how can I adapt what I'm speaking and the language strategies that I'm using in order to try to do the thing I want to do, depending on who I'm reaching? And I think one of the things that was really striking to me as I started to study kind of the trajectory and progression of words, the way they have interacted with social movements over the course of time, is how we not infrequently see these patterns where the same word that's doing one thing for one group of people, right? It's perceived in a certain way. It accomplishes a certain kind of thing in society. And so they develop a very particular relationship with that word. Another group of people, for the very same word, can have this vastly different set of associations. And so because there's no governing authority in English. If you speak French, arguably there are like in French,
Yeah.
there's like governing authorities that say like this is the official French thing. But English has always been this wildly democratic language, which makes it both like super fascinating and deeply messy. And so because it's getting used in these multiple and even sometimes contradictory ways simultaneously, there's really no particular way aside from just saying, well, which group is larger? Who's doing it more? I guess we can side with the majority. But other than that, there's no way of demonstrating, well, these people win, these people lose. Instead, we have to recognize like sometimes the same language that seems to accomplish one set of things over here can accomplish this really other set of things over here. And so it made me super curious as a person of faith, as a person who wants to follow the model of Paul and sort of the pursuit of the gospel to speak to all kinds of people. It made me wonder, well, how can we carefully track the ways the different people in our world are using their language, and are there ways that we can adapt how we speak in order to make the truth of Jesus maximally accessible, maximally cognizable to these very different groups?
Yeah. It kind of feels like you wrote an entire novel about this. And we'll get
I
into some of
think,
that later. But another thing that I think has played into this is this sort of debate between this identity language debate that you've been part of at times.
sure.
And so, for those who are not familiar, since this isn't necessarily the exact same sphere, uh, I guess I could do this, but maybe I'll have you, since you are the one who's been in the midst of it, kind of talk about when it comes to uh, language identity in terms of sexual identity,
Yeah.
uh, in sort of those conversations inside of Christian spheres. What is like the 30,000 foot overview of what this sort of conversation is?
Yeah. So basically, the conversation plays out as follows. There are a handful of people in the world, like myself, who find ourselves exclusively attracted to the same sex, or to take the most culturally common word in English for that experience, we are gay. And who also are committed to historic Christian teaching on marriage and sexuality. So, we would say that sex is reserved for a marriage covenant between male and female. And so I, for example, have chosen to be celibate, which is a source of great delight and sometimes consternation in my life. Also makes me, both popular and deeply unpopular, depending on who you're asking. But one of the questions that arises around an experience like mine is if you find yourself attracted to the same sex, but you're not pursuing a same-sex sexual relationship, you're instead pursuing celibacy, or you're pursuing marriage to an opposite-sex spouse, should you still use culturally normative words like gay or bisexual or lesbian to describe that experience of attraction? Or should you instead use a phrase that's perhaps a bit more religiously coded, or a bit more psychologically coded? So the most common phrase here being same-sex attracted, as a way of describing attraction, but saying, but you're not gay. So the question, I mean, in some ways, this is a very specific manifestation of this broad principle that we were just talking about. The question of, well, if when I'm speaking to one group of people, it feels like they receive the word gay in this way, and they assume the following things about me when I say that I'm gay. But if I talk to this other group of people, they receive the word in this very other way, and they assume a completely different set of things about me. In my case, I have chosen to call myself gay. I wrote a book on the subject, which has the word gay in the title. It's called Single Gay Christian, and there's sort of a little something to peeve everyone in that title, but yeah, for me, the notion that I had the opportunity to choose a word that seemed most likely to speak truthfully and hopefully inspire curiosity among people who were not yet a part of the community of faith. Um, that that compelled me. It felt like an opportunity to be perhaps a bit like Paul, in the sense of becoming all things to all people. And I had hopes that among Christians who might perceive my use of the word gay instinctively as something they disliked, that perhaps because we shared a common faith, they would at least be willing to patiently hear me out and understand why I was choosing to use that word and why it seemed like a strategic way to talk about my experience of sexual attraction. But that's, yeah, I mean, certainly like that debate in itself, could take us hours upon hours. So we needn't get into all the particulars here unless you really want to, Eric. This is your
Indeed.
podcast after all, and not mine.
No, the goal here is not to relitigate this, as it were. And if folks are interested, we can have links in the show notes of different things that you've done in particular, and maybe some other spots, people who've talked about it. But I think my question here, first question here is, what is valuable about this process or exercise, or however you would refer to it, in terms of choosing language or saying what we think is either most faithful, or however you would want to describe that? And what are ways in which this is not a place that we should live in our conversation?
I love that. Um, I think this debate around like the gay versus same-sex attracted terminology has had some really interesting expressions, I think, of both like the benefit of the conversation potentially and the disadvantage of the conversation. And I think I really like the way those things are modeled in a series of blogs that I did in dialogue with a friend of mine named Rachel Gilson, who works with Cru, formerly Campus Crusade for Christ. And Rachel is somebody who prefers to use the term same-sex attracted for herself, doesn't like identifying as gay, and has certain hesitancies or cautions for those of us who do describe ourselves with a word like gay. And I, meanwhile, prefer the term gay. There are certain associations that the term same-sex attracted has, for instance, with the ex-gay movement historically, that I prefer to distance myself from. And so I, in looking at Rachel's use of language, have both some things that I, appreciate and some cautions that I want to give. And I think a few things that came out in that conversation that I think kind of exemplify what we can begin to see as we do any kind of deliberation around language. One of the things that's really helpful about slowing down and having a conversation about, well, why did you pick this word? Why not this word? Is that we can start to warn one another, ideally in gentle and loving ways, to warn one another about some of the potential dangers of the language we choose, or some of the potential misunderstandings. And so, for instance, one of the dangers that Rachel feels like she sees in the term gay is that she worries that the adoption of that term can come to make us perceive our sexuality as too large a part of our human wholeness, that we can come to prioritize it perhaps over other aspects of our humanity, other aspects of our faith that really need to be more primary in the way we view the world. And so part of the reason she prefers a term like same-sex attracted is that she feels like it helps her place her attractions in kind of their proper place in her life, rather than elevating them excessively. And so I love that us having a conversation about language gives us an opportunity to wrestle with the question of like, yeah, how do we steer away from the danger of causing our sexuality to become something that's overly totalizing in our lives, something that we prioritize, for instance, above our pursuit of Jesus. And one of the things that I have said in turn that I think also brings up a really fascinating question and potential concern is I found it helpful to pair the phrase gay Christian with the phrase American Christian, because it seems to me that there are two very different ways of being a gay Christian, right? One of which is to say, oh, because Jesus is the foremost thing in my life, everything else needs to be sort of filtered through who Jesus is. And that includes bringing this part of myself that is my sexuality and putting that also under the lordship of Jesus. That's one way of, being a gay Christian in the sense of using the adjective gay to describe yourself. But there's another way of being a gay Christian, which is to say, like, oh, being gay is so central to who I am that everything else, including my pursuit of Jesus, has to get filtered through being gay. And so whatever it means to me to be a disciple of Jesus, I will determine that based on my perception of what it feels like to be gay. So the question is sort of like, which of those words gets to be in charge? And so a thing that I love to point out is that that's really not unique to the phrase gay Christian or to any use of an adjective to describe ourselves. And I find it really helpful to compare it to the phrase American Christian, precisely because I think there are also two very distinct ways of being an American Christian, right? One of which is to say, because I am in submission to Jesus, I need to recognize the reality of my American citizenship. And I need to grapple really well with the question of what it looks like to be obedient to Jesus when I live in this nation that has absurd wealth and absurd power, often at the expense of our global neighbors. And often as a result of the ways we've mistreated people through history. I need to bring all of that into my discipleship to Jesus and say, like, Jesus, how do you want me to make sense of the fact that I'm American? That's one, and I would posit a really valuable way of being an American Christian. But there's also this other way of being an American Christian, right, which is to make our Americanness the lens through which our Christianity is filtered, and to devise this new vision of Jesus in which Jesus' greatest priority is for America to be great, for America to be first in the world, even at the expense of everybody else who Jesus loves, right? It's to devise this new Americanized form of Christianity that would be, by the standards of Jesus himself in the early church, totally unrecognizable. So once we recognize, so as we have a conversation then about like, okay, this word gay, like, should we use it? Should we not? A careful conversation about a word like that can actually begin to reveal all kinds of dynamics. Hey, what are we doing with all of our language? And how is that enlightening, or how is it disguising the ways that we want to walk well as people of faith? I think that's where the conversation can be really beautiful, can be such a gift. Where I think the conversation begins to become a problem is when it turns into quarreling, when it becomes a higher priority than actually recognizing our common cause as the people of God. There are plenty of people, especially, though I think not exclusively from the more conservative, if you will, side of the debate around gay and SSA, who would, for instance, look at the debate that Rachel and I have around those terms and say, Rachel, you really need to distance yourself from Greg because, he's using that dangerous gay word. And so you really need to just like stop treating him like a brother. You got to cut that guy off. And I think those who make differences in language a reason to divide with one another, I think that causes us to work at odds with Jesus' final prayer in the garden for his people, which is that we would be unified. I think Paul's call in the epistles to us is to not quarrel over words, precisely because I think Paul is smart enough to recognize that sometimes different people are going to be called into different uses of words for different reasons. And so Paul is saying, in the spirit of the prayer of Jesus, like, your unity as people of faith is so much more important than the ways that your language might differ. So I think at whatever point our recognition of difference in language becomes a source of disunity, then I think we've missed the heart of Jesus accordingly. But I think insofar as we can have thoughtful and reasoned conversation without creating disunity, I think that conversation can be incredibly revealing and incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for that, of using different adjectives to describe yourself along with Christian. So to your example
Mhm.
of American Christian, not only does that like place myself where I am in the world, it's it can help me to see how other people have different experiences than I do, and that hopefully at its best shows us that there are different perspectives that we have, or that different perspectives that other people have, so that they can also contribute to our understanding of Christianity and the world. So
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
some ways, it is difference shows us how we can be unified, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
Another thing that came to mind while you were talking is something like the word evangelical and how that has taken on different meanings in different places. So, as an example, I, for the first time, went on one of like a day at the Capitol sort of deal with a
Hmm.
local group here, and met my state senator, who is a very liberal Democrat. And when I identified myself as an evangelical Christian, there was a wall that went up that I had not experienced in the past until he found out which church I went to. And then he was like, oh, I like that church. Wall came back down a little bit. So, but it's one of those things where we have the same word and it means different things to different people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have other places in the world where you're seeing that right now, or in our country or wherever, of we're using language that is the same but means different things to different people?
Yeah, I mean, your example of evangelical is such a good one. In fact, I was having a conversation with some friends last night about that very word and our complicated relationship to it. Um, because on one level, it seems to sort of accurately describe aspects of what we believe, aspects of how we want to approach Jesus, and yet at the same time it now carries this set of like socio-political implications that we're not necessarily bought into. I'm reminded of there's a collection called Still Evangelical question mark.
Yep.
And one of the essays in it's a great book. One of the essays in there, I believe it's by Sandra Maria van Opstal, but she's writing about pastoring in a community with a large Latino population, and um, she describes some of her congregants saying of themselves, "Oh, we're not evangelical; somos evangelicos." And what that group is trying to do with that, you know, we're not evangelical in English. Why? Because we recognize the state of the English conversation right now. We don't feel like we can align ourselves with some of the baggage that word is carrying. But as far as evangelicos is concerned, like as far as what we know that word in Spanish to mean about our faith commitments, that's still absolutely who we are. And I tragically, you know next to no Spanish, and so have absolutely no right to refer to myself as evangelicos. And yet, I found myself a little bit jealous in reading that because I was like, yeah, I also wish that I had a way of simultaneously saying like I'm totally an evangelical and I am not an all an evangelical. Like, am I allowed to say both of those things at once? Like, what are my avenues here? So anyway, yeah, I think that's a tremendously good and important example right now. Um, and even more broadly, I think the word Christian is having a time right now. Um, and I don't think we're going to lose the word Christian. The word evangelical, it's much newer. It's been through a lot of eras, and I don't know that we're going to manage to keep it. Honestly, if I had to guess based on the general trajectories of words that go through a journey like evangelical, my guess would be that word is going to die out. Christian, on the other hand, I think we're going to keep. We've had some form of Christian or its cognates since first century Greek and Latin. So, and it has managed to spread the word Christian in a cognate form, Christen, something like that, is in so many languages around the world, has been for millennia. I think we're going to keep the word, and yet we are also in an era when there's a great amount of misunderstanding about what that word means. if you think about the socio-political context in the US right now, where one of the biggest ways that the word Christian is currently showing up in public discourse is around the phrase Christian nationalism, right? Which implies a very particular vision of Christianity being extended along national lines. And so I think it creates challenge and opportunity for those of us who are deeply committed to the person of Christ, and therefore, in many ways, inescapably tied to the word Christian, who nonetheless need to recognize, like, oh, it may be that some of our neighbors right now, when they hear this accurate word about me, are going to carry with that word a set of baggage, a set of associations that I need to be really thoughtful in how I engage with. And so I often find that I wait to introduce the word Christian until maybe the second or third sentence about faith, that I want to start by saying something like, gosh, I'm so compelled by the teachings of Jesus. Why? Because I think tragically, a lot of my non-Christian friends currently, when they think people who are compelled by and want to live by the teachings of Jesus, they don't tend to think Christian. And when they think Christian, they don't tend to think people who want to live by and are compelled by the teachings of Jesus. And so I prefer to start the conversation with, I'm really down with this Jesus guy. And gosh, I want to figure out what it looks like to live my life in a way that's ordered around his teachings. And oh yeah, BT dubs, that totally makes me a Christian. But I prefer to start the conversation elsewhere if possible, if only in recognition of the fact that some of the baggage that's recently accrued around that term is baggage that I want to be cautious in how I engage.
Yeah, that is so interesting and also disappointing in a very like hits at the heart sort of way, that is where our people have gone to. I sort of think of that too, also in Spanish. So I had a professor in seminary who uh, was half Guatemalan, spent a lot of his time growing up in Guatemala, worked in Guatemala before he ended up at the seminary. And he would use the Spanish phrase, and now as I'm trying to pull it off the top of my head, SOS mi gente, these are my people, especially in the immigration discussions. It's like he would be able to go into a room, and because he didn't necessarily present as looking stereotypically Guatemalan. And so people would say things around him, not knowing that that's who he was and who he sympathized with.
Yeah.
And it's like no, these are my people. And there's a way in which I think we need to expand who our people are as Christians,
Yeah.
especially here in this country. Somewhat to that point, I've been thinking a lot, especially in the current administration, about the way language is being used to create groups of others, othering language and things of that nature. So I told you I just had a conversation with Ed Uzinski. We talked a lot about CRT, and there's a way that term has become like a boogeyman term, using that language to mean something that is not what it actually is.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight into how to ask this question? Any insight into just whether it be dangers of othering language, thinking about that as Christians, maybe just starting from there and kind of working our way to some sort of something coherent?
Yeah. When I think about othering language as that has sort of played out historically, there's a fabulous book by a scholar named Haig Bosmasian called "The Language of Oppression," and it's a relatively old book. I think it came out in the 80s. But the great thing about books about history is that as long as they were doing history well at the time they were written, the history still applies. It's not like ancient history, became less historical more recently. Although I suppose arguably, if you look at some of the language coming out of the current administration about how we should and should not talk about U.S. history, there is perhaps an attempt to limit certain framings of history. But leaving that aside for the time being, one of the things that Bosmasian does really well is talk about the ways uses of language to frame an other group um, as in some way uh, either less than human or just sort of like a different categorization of human, how that language can effectively lay the groundwork for things that are much more easily perceived as harm than language by itself. Right? We have phrases like, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. To which Bosmasian is like, well, the words may not hurt you. But once the Nazis have referred to the Jews as vermin and cockroaches enough times, then it begins to make it seem like just an obvious thing that, well, what do you do with vermin and cockroaches? You hire an exterminator. What should we do with this group that we've now no longer characterized as people, but rather as vermin and cockroaches? Well, we just follow our language to its logical conclusion. And so whether or not the language itself hurt, the people who were harmed by the Holocaust, Jews and other groups, whether or not that we see that language itself as harm, we can at the very least look at the language, see direct lines being drawn by those who use that language to really, really dramatic forms of harm. And so Bosmasian is doing this. I mean, certainly he has a section on the rhetoric of the Nazis during the Holocaust, but he also has some fascinating sections on the language used by the United States to characterize indigenous peoples, a section on language used to describe women historically, a section on language used to describe African American people and people of African descent more broadly. So he's tracing these movements. And I mean, so if you're reading this book as a person of faith, I think whether or not you, in every case, think that Bosmasian draws every line perfectly accurately, I think what he does undeniably is demonstrate that there is this through line of connection between how we can set up language in a way that takes a group of people and says, like, well, let's create a separate category for that group. How that language isn't just language necessarily, but it will often become the catalyst for the engine for the ways that we engage with people. And it makes me think now of, for instance, the language that we use to talk about undocumented people, ranging from attempts at very humanizing language to attempts at very intentionally dehumanizing language. Certainly, so some of the things I've seen recently emerging about immigration policies seem very intentionally designed to portray a whole group of people not primarily through the lens of their humanity, but primarily in some other fashion. And any attempt to use language to distance people from their own humanity concerns me in part because I think historically we often see that move as a way of setting the stage for treating people like something other than human. And so, yeah, whether or not the language by itself concerns you, whether you think I'm, just some snobby academic complaining about words, at the very least, I hope we can be concerned about the potential possibility that once we have started characterizing people as something other than human, it will make us feel more okay with treating them as something other than human. And that's where I hope our desire to live like people of Jesus kicks in and says, absolutely not. We are absolutely required by our love for Jesus to be people who treat one another as human, people who treat one another in the ways that we ourselves would want to be treated, who treat one another as people who bear the imago Dei, the image of God.
Yeah. And what that brings to mind for me, I think he is a Brazilian. I don't know if he's a theologian, sociologist, scholar of some sort named Paulo Freire, who talks about the thing that has stuck with me from him is his discussion about dehumanizing and how
Mm,
the only way to dehumanize another person is to also dehumanize yourself. That a
mm,
human cannot see another human as not human unless they don't recognize their own humanity. And it
mm,
seems like when it does come to that image of God in all of us, that is a thing that is of primary concern, especially with how early in the Bible that idea is introduced. That's something I think about systematic theology as a discussion from seminary,
yeah,
and that when you are laying out a systematic theology, you start with what is most important, and then you
yeah,
can tell what a theologian thinks is more important than other things because of where it is placed in there. I think there's some of that in the Bible too, where
yeah,
that is how some things are worked out. It comes this early because it is this important. And so it's the thing
yeah,
we need to continue thinking about.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm struck too by how, yeah, if you look at the laying out of the early chapters of Genesis, um, the ways that the image of God precedes the truth of human fallenness. I think so often in the ways we maybe have conversations about Christian theology now, there can be a temptation to start our conversations about people as if human sinfulness is the most central truth about humankind. Um, and to be sure, human sinfulness is like a significant aspect of, humankind. But there does seem to be, per your point, there seems to be something about Genesis that wants to make the point that there is something that is more primarily true about us. There's something that has priority in the sense of being chronologically prior in the narrative. And that thing that takes priority is that before we are fallen, we are image bearers. I love that.
Yeah, that's a good word too. So we've already touched on a novel that you wrote that kind of explores language, as it were. Can you kind of just give like a broad synopsis of what that is and what you were working to do through that novel?
Yeah. So this is a novel. It's called The Limits of My World. It came out late in 2023, so about a year and a half ago. And really, what I wanted to explore in this novel is um, how language creates opportunity and also limits opportunity to perceive our world and each other as meaningfully human, to perceive our world and one another in accurate or inaccurate ways. And so I began toying with this idea of, like, what if somebody had this really limited sense of language and it caused them to perceive the world in a really particular kind of way? But then as their sense of language expanded, their understanding of the world that they lived in, who the people around them were, what the vision of humanity was, all of those things sort of expanded with the scope of their language. And I was like, well, the only way to do that, interestingly, is to bring the reader along on that journey. And so so I've found this novel incredibly difficult to explain, because if I explain it using language that you're most familiar with, I'm sort of like giving things away to you that the reader and the characters shouldn't understand until somewhat later in the story. But it is sort of this progressive journey through language, for somebody who, at the beginning of the story believes that they are about to receive a new skin. They can run around the perimeter of the universe in 17 minutes. There are all kinds of oddities about them, but they understand themselves to be human. And so the question is this person actually human? Are they just someone who perceives themselves as human? Why do they live in this universe that either is very small or they're very fast? Why is their skin blue and exchangeable? And so all of these things are things that you're sort of wrestling with alongside the character. In many ways, I wrote the novel as sort of like a fan fiction, science fiction ode to the Tower of Babel, because it is sort of wrestling with that Babel-esque notion of the mixing up of our language, and then trying to ask, how would this play out in a science fictional setting where the world is allowed to be both so remarkably different and yet so congruous with the world that we live in right now. So yeah, I was telling somebody recently, they were like, does your book address current social issues, talking about this novel? And I was like, well, on the one hand, no, like I tried very hard not to be preachy. But on the other hand, like I spent the entire time writing this book being like, holy snot, this is so much like every social issue going on right now. So yeah, I think it's a good romp. I think it's a fun time as a science fiction novel, but I also like to think there's some fruitful wrestling with the question of like, how are we engaging words and what is that doing to our capability to work together or to not work together, to not even see one another as meaningfully human.
Yeah. And it does seem like science fiction is a great genre to make that happen.
Yeah.
So I was I heard you talking about this right after it came out on Theology in the Raw, and the point came up that someone had described it as being a lot like The Giver. And
Oh,
I don't know that I actually did this, but I had like in an internal like Rocky at the top of the steps raising his fists like I felt that way too. So I think the way I would describe it is like The Giver meets The Matrix, and then eventually some pieces of Wall-E come in as well.
oh my gosh. I
You have
love all
to
three of those. So that's terrific.
you have to read the book to know how all those things fit together, but that's sort of my perspective on it.
That's brilliant. I love it.
But so I told you a couple days ago I wasn't going to just read quotes at you on that call, but I will do a little bit of that here
Ooh,
in
fun.
sort of a pseudo lightning round
Oh, excellent.
way. Uh, and part of this is going to be because it's a novel, you can't necessarily say the book said this thing, so this is what Greg believes. Like that's not the way a novel works compared to a more nonfiction-esque book. But I think they inspire some questions that I'm curious to explore.
Yeah, great.
So, the first quote I have: before language was created, there was unity. In what ways does language inspire disunity?
Yeah. I mean, well, I mentioned just now the Tower of Babel, and I think in the Genesis account, that is not the creation of communication, but it's the instantiation of what we now understand as language is, because prior, without a sense of language being a thing that multiple different people can have, you don't need nearly the same kind of awareness of language. It's just, oh yeah, we don't need to talk about it. We don't need to think about it. We just all open our mouths and know what we mean. Um, but the moment you start to have different languages, or even the moment I say a word and you hear something, but it's not the same thing that I was trying to communicate when I said the word, the moment we create the possibility for miscommunication or for failure to communicate, then we create the possibility for some kind of severing between us, that is rooted in our language. And so I think, uh, yeah, certainly one of the things that I think the characters in that novel are wrestling with is the potential that maybe their language isn't as straightforwardly correct and the only way of thinking about the world as they've perceived it. And so by being forced to see that maybe there's another way of using words than the way that they've got, they start to become aware of language as a thing because they don't really have a concept of it uh, apart from that possibility for disunity. I don't know if that makes sense, but it is. Yeah, if nothing else, this is me trying to a little bit gloss Genesis 11 and say I think that's one of the things that the author or authors of Genesis were keen to note about the human experience is that some part of our falling apart as a human race, is tied to the reality that we speak words and we often fail to communicate effectively to each other.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me. I think that us there are a couple other of these that will bring some more of those ideas in here. The next one I have, truth is always a treason to the rules of language.
So
How
fun.
how how does truth stand outside of language? How do we then try to represent truth with the language we do have?
Uh, uh there's So in Koine Greek, which is the kind of Greek the New Testament is written in, there are two different words for word. There's logos and there's rhema. Um, Maybe there are more besides those two. If any classicists want to come knocking at my door and be like, "You forgot the other word for word," I do apologize. But these are two that are like significant in the New Testament texts. Um, and logos is that's what we see Jesus described as in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the logos. The logos was with God. The logos was God. Um, but then rhema is the word that we see Paul talking about when he says, uh, uh, or oh, actually, rhema may not show up in. I was going to say the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. In Paul, that may not be rhema. That may be a word that means letter instead of word. Anyway, I should have done more careful textual study on rhema, logos, etc. before I attempted to make this statement. But I will carry on, sally forth nonetheless, and make the following statement, which is I think that there's a difference in conception in the Greek mindset and in the mindset that we see pervade in the New Testament, between like word in the sense of like the dominating idea that is truth, right? That is truth in the sense that Jesus is truth, um, and the letter or word in the more mundane sense of the rhema, the thing that we attempt to slap onto the truth, and try to characterize it in some way. Um, and I'm struck, for instance, by how many of our words about God are really just words saying that God is not like something that we know how to understand. Right. So it's like God is invisible, and he's infinite. Which just like he's not visible. We don't really know what the non-visible thing is. We just know it's not the thing that we're used to. And he's not finite. We don't really know what infinity looks like. We just know that we know finite stuff, and God's not that. Um, and so on and so forth. There's so much of our attempt to characterize who God is basically about saying, well, we picked words that describe the world that we've interacted with, that describe what we know how to see. And the thing we can confidently tell you about God is that he's not that. He is some other thing. But insofar as language is tied to our ability to look at the world around us, then our language is always going to fall short of actually capturing the fullness of God. It can speak truthfully about God, but it speaks truthfully with limits. Now, in the context of that particular line that you read from the novel, in that case, I'm talking about the language that's being spoken by those characters, which is a language that has been very purposefully limited in certain kinds of ways, and limited in ways that disguises certain forms of the truth. Now, in the novel, I very intentionally set up those forms of disguise so that you can identify them as the reader, so that you can kind of wrestle with what it would be like to speak that language and then to discover that there's actually more going on than you understood. I think that same disguising can also happen in our own language. I don't think it's exclusive to science fiction novels, though I think the disguising is somewhat more subtle. But when we take, for instance, the truth of a phrase like "God is love," right? That on the level of logos, this is absolutely true. We know this to be true about God, that God is love. Unfortunately, because our sense of what love is is shaped by the ways that we perceive love in the world around us. It's shaped by the cultural baggage that accrues around the idea of love. It's in some ways tainted by the reality that every kind of love that we've ever seen has these very earthly and human limits to it. And so there's a sense in which to rightfully, truthfully say that God is love, because it's relying on our human understanding, is always going to fall short of the reality of the love that God is. There's always going to be a truth that exceeds whatever limitations our words attempt to put around that truth. And so I think that's part of why, for God to condescend to humankind and to even allow himself to be characterized by our language, requires this incredible humility on God's part, right? The book of Philippians describes Jesus' descent to earth as a reflection of his incredible humility, right? That he took on our flesh, became one of us, made himself obedient even to death on a cross. These things that are reflective of Jesus' humility and his condescension. And I think we also see that humility in the way that every part of the Godhead condescends to allow itself to be described by these flimsy words spoken by these flimsy and finite human beings. That God, who so far exceeds our capacity to describe God, still consents to be described by us.
Wow, that's a mic drop moment a little bit. I didn't expect it to end that way, but that was incredible.
Good.
All right, a couple more here. I think this is from the same scene, basically. And now the language you used to know will begin to feel too small for you. It was built to hide things you're learning to see. I think you kind of touched a little bit on some of those ideas already with that last response, but what are some ways in English where the language that we know limits what we're able to see?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that really got me thinking deeply about this was in graduate school. I took a course on disability studies, and so it was looking at various experiences that fall broadly within the umbrella of disability. But one of the things we talked about was even the word disability itself, which characterizes certain kinds of conditions through the lens of what they are not, right? Through the removal of abledness. But then I started to read about some of these people, some of these stories that fit within this disability category. And so I read, for instance, about the ways that people who are blind can develop this remarkable sense of ability to create spatial awareness through hearing, to engage with spaces in this really bodily aware kind of way that if you had me close my eyes right now and try to navigate the world with my eyes closed, I would be totally lost. But for someone who is blind, they have this remarkable capacity to know things about the world around them that I haven't developed because I've been so reliant on my eyesight. And so it got me thinking, are there things that I have just experiences that I've casually sort of lumped into oh, well, that's disability. And as the language suggests, disability is just the absence of ability. So it's clearly a disadvantage. And I instead began to ask, actually, are there some of these differences in embodiment or differences in the ways our brain works that certainly can create certain kinds of challenges for a person, that might be challenges that I, as somebody who's, neurotypical and has a more typical physical embodiment, I don't experience those challenges. But those kinds of embodiments may also create opportunities that I don't experience because of the way that I'm structured. And so that willingness to say, let me not just trust the word disability, to tell me that somebody else is worse off than I am, but let me instead dare to ask, is it possible that in addition to the disadvantages that come with that, there are also advantages, and that actually the most loving thing I can do, in addition to serving where there are disadvantages, is also to celebrate where there are advantages and to learn from people whose advantages have something unique to offer to me.
Yeah, that's I don't have any other thing to add to that. I got two more here.
Oh, excellent. Bring them on.
All right. This is from sort of the for folks in the world, this is like the or who haven't read the book. This is like the italicized portion of the book, which you will
Ooh.
understand when you read the book, but there's a part where someone says they're all saving the soul of our nation, every last one of them. Trouble is nobody agrees what the soul of our nation needs saving from.
Mm.
I'm kind of curious within uh, American Christianity how you see, like, what do you see as differences of what we think, what different people inside of American Christianity think America needs saving from?
Oh, yeah. Whew. Yeah. What do we think we need saving from? Um, I mean, yeah, some of the most obvious answers feel like the ones that kind of accrue around the poles of the political spectrum. So I think on one side of the political spectrum, we have people who feel like our nation needs uh saving from wokeness. It needs saving from LGBTQ people. It needs saving from immigrants. Um, and maybe to frame, I mean, to say saving from LGBTQ people or saving from immigrants maybe is not the most charitable framing of what their concern is. But I think in some cases their concern is that there's a certain kind of moral infection um, that can accrue around those groups from which we need saving. So they might believe, for instance, rightly or wrongly, and I would argue that this is largely a very unhelpful caricature. But perhaps part of their concern around immigration might be like, oh, those are people who are going to bring in, they're going to bring in lots of drugs, they're going to bring in sex trafficking, they're going to bring in, and so they would see these certain forms of moral depravity as being tied to this incoming group of people. And so maybe even if they want to feel charitably about the group of people, they feel like, well, but we have to be saved from these various sort of incoming forms of moral depravity. Um, I also think on that political side of the spectrum, though it's perhaps harder to defend along Christian lines, there might be people who feel like America needs saving from uh, a loss of power, a loss of global dominance, a loss of certain kinds of economic success or comfort. Um, these these threats that they perceive as incoming, that they'd like to see us saved from. Um, and then I think if we look on the other side of the political spectrum, we might see people who want to characterize America's malaise largely in terms of our need to be saved from things like racism, to be saved from global greed, to be saved from sexism and homophobia, um, to be saved from some of the isms that might feel to that group like accurate characterizations of the other side of the conversation. Um, I think in its most hopeful sense, I think maybe everybody feels like we need to be saved from a kind of inhumanity. Um, that everybody has a particular kind of inhumanness that they're really, really afraid we're moving toward, and they want to move us back toward like proper and kind and loving humanness. Um, but I think the perceived danger that they're looking to is often so different. the ways they wind up arguing for the soul of our nation to be saved, yeah, do wind up being remarkably conflicting. Which is why, even though that sentence you wrote, I didn't necessarily write it particularly with the United States currently in mind. It does feel like a classic problem that everybody's like, we're saving the soul of the nation, and just no one can agree what it is that we're saving it from.
Yeah. I think my lone follow-up question in this lightning round portion is going to be uh, some sort of it seems like the way to help bridge those differences is just the need for a charitable understanding or approach to the other
Mm,
person in attempting that. How does language play into that?
I think I think if we're willing to slow down a conversation long enough to say, is it possible that the person I'm talking to doesn't mean all the same things by all the words they're using that I do? Um, that is often the best way that we can begin to find some common ground, some common cause with each other. Um, because I think often if we just rely on our catchphrases, if we just rely on our assumptions of what other folks' words mean, um, then we may breeze right by our best opportunities to say, oh, I actually hear you caring about this thing that is also something that I care about. Um, oh, when you said that thing that sounded incredibly offensive to me, I realized it was actually because you're concerned for this particular group of people who I also want to be concerned about the well being of that group of people. Um, and maybe if we can slow down the conversation well enough to see, is there a form of care? Is there a form of concern that you have that I can resonate with, even if I think the ways you're trying to get us there are deeply wrong minded? Uh, if I can see if I can see some sympathy for the concern that you feel, um, then maybe that's a place to begin, to find more charity with one another. And I think we can often do that by slowing down, by asking more carefully, not just what we assume one another's words mean, but what we really intend by them.
Yeah, that's so good. The last one here in our pseudo lightning round, slowest lightning round ever, is not actually from The Limits of My World. It's from your book No Longer Strangers.
Ooh,
So the quote is, "Sometimes our words become so familiar that we forget what they mean." How do we, how do we, is there a need to combat that? If so, how do we do that? And how persistent do we, or how front of mind does that need to be in terms of like an amount of time that we're spending on that?
I think it's very natural for our brains to tend toward developing a sense of familiarity. Um, right? We're sort of ordered to develop rhythms, to find habits, and to not need to constantly rethink stuff, because it's our brain's way of saving time and saying, okay, I got to think about other stuff. So how can I sort of stop thinking about stuff that I don't need to anymore? Um, and so words are one of those things that so easily become rhythmic for us, and rightfully so. We don't have to self-flagellate just because our brain does the thing that brains are wired to do, which is become familiar. Um, but one of the practices that I found really helpful in my own spiritual life is to find ways of sort of habitually defamiliarizing certain aspects of my faith. Um, and so, um, for me, reading in different languages, if there are other languages that I or you have capacity with, even if it's not great capacity, if it's enough to be able to work your way, for instance, through a text of scripture and say, oh, let me read this in a different language. Um, or if I can't read it in a different language, let me at least hear somebody else read it in their language, and see if I can hear what it feels like to them. Um, or sometimes simply slowing down, um, taking, say, a verse that feels like deeply familiar to me and saying, actually, let me slow this down and let me spend more time on it than I'm accustomed to spending, and see if there's actually something I discover in slowness that I haven't seen in haste. Or if you can't read different languages, I think reading different translations of the Bible can also be tremendously helpful. One thing we often do in my faith community is use the Message paraphrase of Scripture, which is a wonderful. I mean, there are some things in the Message, and I think such wonderful thoughts about Eugene Peterson. I also think he totally missed it in some of his attempts to render certain aspects of Scripture. But I love reading from the Message because it's so unlike. Because it takes some creative liberties, because it creates a bit of distance from the original text, it actually helps me often to see things that have become sort of rote and familiar, to see them with a kind of fresh eyes. So all of those practices have been, for me, really helpful in taking the thing that becomes so familiar I've forgotten what it means, and defamiliarizing it enough for me to imbue it with a fresh sense of meaning.
Yeah. It's so funny to me that was your example, because I don't know if you know the name Michelle Warren. She's someone I know from Denver.
Yeah.
But I had her on the podcast a number of episodes ago now, and I don't remember if it made the cut or not, but she said the same thing, that she's in the Message now because of how familiar other translations have become. So I think that is
Brilliant.
a good note, that it's not just in the words we use necessarily. It is also
Sure.
in how we are understanding then
Yeah.
what it means to be Christian, and what we are attempting to receive from what is being taught to us.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I think that's going to be our place to stop now, just based off of our time. But
Fantastic.
That was great. Yeah.
Oh, that was so fun.
Me.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Eric. This was a really fun conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.